A CISO being charged in federal and state courts? Are you kidding me? This is a brand new event that happened last week, and I want to dive in and cover what this means for us. What is going on in this court case? What's going to come out of it? And what ramifications can we all learn? If you're curious to know more about the Uber breach and what it means for all of us, stay tuned. You are in the right place. We are going to cover that and more coming right up. Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Wes Spencer. Welcome to my channel. We talk about all things innovative technology. I am a technologist, I'm a cybersecurity guy, and I'm also a CISO. And so this news event with Uber has really hit close to home with me and those in my circles, simply because we're very curious to know what is truly going on here, and more importantly, what's the ramifications for all of us. So very quickly, if you don't know what's going on, I want to give you a quick introduction of what happened. So the previous Uber security executive, Joe Sullivan, has had some charges filed against him by federal and state courts last week. At this point, I'm just going to use the word allegedly through all of this because this is just Wes's personal opinions of what's coming out of all of this. I don't have any personal inside knowledge and information, and my legal team has even encouraged me just to make sure that I talk about this and say this is Wes's personal opinions with no reflection to the companies that I work for or represent, just my thoughts. Now let's talk and start here. First of all, if you don't know what a CISO is, it's a Chief Information Security Officer. These are the security executives designated in these companies that are responsible for the cybersecurity program. They're responsible for building it, maturing it, maintaining it, communicating it, and making sure that it is shared and effective, not just with the executives and all employees, but also clients and customers, as applies to this case that we're talking about today, and other third parties, including federal, state, and local governments when it applies. And this is really the crux of the matter here, that all of this kind of comes together, is because when it comes to cybersecurity, when it comes to breaches, there are certain things that need to happen, and there's timelines that need to happen inside of all of these things. And so here's what happened with Uber. This happened a few years ago, but they had a breach in which the emails and phone numbers of about 57 million customers were exposed. Now, that's not a good thing. Fortunately for Uber, at least it wasn't things like social security numbers, payment card information, things like that. But in today's age of privacy, that is personal and confidential information. So not a good thing. Now let me be really clear. The purpose of this video is not to disparage Joe Sullivan or Uber or anybody else who's been involved in this breach, because here's the deal. Anybody who's been in the trenches in cybersecurity as a CISO or anyone else in security knows that breaches happen. They can and do happen to all of us. They're unfortunate circumstances. I truly view these things as brothers and sisters in arms when they happen, and I want to kind of put my arms around them and say, hey, I've been there too. It's not a fun event, but we all go through these things. Now, of course, there's negligence that oftentimes is at play, but not always. And the purpose of this video, as I mentioned, I'm not going to go here into a rant on blaming Uber for some of these practices. I could do that in other videos, but there's certainly been enough that's been said from third-party news sources about what this happened. I want to stick to the facts of what we know, and then I want to interpret that and why I think it's important for all of us. Going back to what we know last week, federal charges were filed against Joe Sullivan, who was the previous CISO of Uber and had his tenure when this breach occurred. Now, to my knowledge, this is the very first time we have seen charges filed against a security executive for or revolving around some kind of cybersecurity incident. So that's really interesting to me. It's interesting because I think it's the first time and it sets a precedent. And I think most of us are wondering, well, is this going to happen again and again and again? And if so, what would trigger that? And what are the things I need to do and lessons learned to take away to make sure that doesn't happen to me? And so I think this is why this is so important for all of us. Now, you should know that the affidavit itself is public information. Anyone can go and look at it. And in the affidavit, the U.S. attorneys are very clear. They're not going after Uber and Sullivan simply because of a breach. They're going after them, and the charges were filed simply because they, in their view, were not notified of what happened. And this is the crux of the matter, is failure to notify, which they are interpreting as obstruction of justice. Now, Wes is not a lawyer, and I'm not trying to be one, but we clearly see in here there's a difference between having a breach and not notifying a breach. Those are two different things. I can have a breach as an organization, which is an unfortunate event, but not notifying and going through the proper procedures as we are required to do, this is where the real danger happens. In fact, if you read the quote from the U.S. attorney leading the prosecution on this case, look what he said. When a company like Uber gets hacked, we expect good corporate citizenship. We expect prompt disclosure to the employee and consumer victims in that hack. In this case, what we saw was the exact opposite of good corporate behavior. So you can see here the view of the federal government here in these charges is simply not because of the breach, but because of the lack of notification around it. So I think that's enough of the surrounding information. If you want to know more about the mechanics of what happened, you're just a Google search away. The purpose of my video today is not to dive into all of the things that happened specifically and what we know up to this date, but really to talk largely about my interpretation of why this matters. So if we go back historically and what triggered this event and what caused the charges to be filed, the affidavit is pretty clear about what happened. Now, allegedly, when all of this occurred, Uber did not disclose this event to anybody, as we've said. And it wasn't just Sullivan, it was also the CEO at the time who equally did not publish or share or make this known anywhere. Yikes. See, that's not a good thing. When breaches occur, one of the things we need to do is be very clear in our communication of what happened. Covering these things up and hoping that they don't get out into the news is a very dangerous proposition. Now, we know why these things happen. We know why the cover-ups happen. They're as old as data breaches have ever been. If we can cover them up and nobody knows the wiser, it's not going to affect our stock prices, it's not going to affect our public image, it's not going to affect revenue and all of these kinds of things. That's typically the mindset of CEOs and those that run companies, is cover a breach up if you can because we won't suffer damages from it. But we've wisened up. The federal government has wisened up, and there are now laws in place, especially at the state levels, that require disclosure of breaches. Because we know that organizations are not incented to share about a breach when it occurs for the hopes that it will never be known and they'll never suffer external damages. And it's not about the damages. It's really not. What it's really about is making sure that those who have been affected are aware so that they can take action. If credit monitoring needs to happen and other things that have to occur, that is the real goal of disclosing a breach, to make sure that those who've been affected are made aware. And so this is what all of this case comes down to, is in the federal government's view, they were simply not notified of what happened when Uber had the breach. And one more newsflash for you. I can tell you as a CISO, it's typically not the CISO's job to do the disclosure of the breach. Remember, the CISO is in charge of the information security program itself, but typically the disclosure of the breach comes down to legal making that decision, the CEO and sometimes the board making that decision, and very rarely is it actually communicated by the CISO. It's usually by public relations and others inside of the organization that handle the actual notification of the breach. And to me, this is where the whole thing gets really sticky. We need to ask ourselves here, how much of this was Sullivan's fault and how much of this was others inside of Uber that decided to not make the call to disclose the breach? See, I think sometimes we can knee-jerk to just saying, well, it's the security person's job because of the security breach. But inside of a corporation, there's a lot of mechanics that are happening and going on at the same time that would involve others. And so it's not so simple and vanilla as just saying go after directly the CISO because only that person is involved. Now, I'm not the federal government. I don't have all of the knowledge. I don't have subpoena authority. I'm just going after what I've seen in the affidavit and what we know publicly about this event and typically what the laws and legislations around disclosure events say. But this, coming back to it, is really where it gets sticky, right? Because it's not just Sullivan who is involved in this, and typically it's not the CISO themselves that are ones responsible for notifying about the breach. It's others. And when you go and read news sources, you will see this. A spokesman for Sullivan said this exactly. He said, Sullivan was just operating under the legal requirements and recommendations of Uber. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know that any of us will know without documentation, but there is a hint of truth to this that typically exists in the middle of a breach, is the CISO recommends that the legal department get involved. legal, what do you say that we should do? How do we handle these things? And so oftentimes if legal says stand down, don't do these things, or just back off, we'll handle it from here, well, that's a lot of times very clear and evident information that the CISO will just follow what legal says. Because legal typically is the ones that know the law and know how to handle all of these things. The CISO is responsible for protecting information security assets, and that's where their job stops. And so if the spokesman for Sullivan is correct, and he was simply following what legal said, then it's going to be difficult for a case here to really come against Sullivan. But again, going back to what the affidavit says and some public information that the affidavit has made available, we know it's really not that simple. We do know that there was some discussion around all of this, and one of those pieces of discussion comes around the idea of Sullivan and the CEO at the time having discussions around this, and Uber's decision to wrap this under a bug bounty program. In other words, saying, hey, this was a known issue and a bug bounty found all of this. It wasn't bad guys. It was actually just a bug bounty program that was involved and somebody found it and disclosed it. We wrapped it under that. And so that's what the authorities are saying is, hey, not only did you not disclose it, but you guys kind of kept it secret and wrapped it and spun it in a different way than it had actually happened. And I do think the other thing that drew the ire of the FTC was this. They were already in the middle of an investigation of a breach that Uber had 2 years prior to this occurring. Whoa. So you have to put yourself in the shoes of the FTC, who's been doing investigation into that breach that happened 2 years prior, and Uber not telling them about the current breach. That's not a good look for any corporation, and that truly is one of the things that drew the ire and focus and potentially the charges, allegedly, that came out of all of this. Now, the aftermath to this story is important as well. After Uber terminated its CEO, they brought in a new one, Dara Khosrowshahi, and what he did was he truly cleaned house. He terminated the CISO, he terminated their head of legal inside of information security, and really truly took some actions to kind of correct all of this. And he made a quote that I thought was really good. He said, our decision in 2017 to disclose the incident was not only the right thing to do, it embodies the principles by which we are running our business today: transparency, integrity, and accountability. So to Khosrowshahi, good for you. That was the right statement to make, and you can tell he believed in it because he took action in not just deciding to disclose that breach as the new CEO that had happened not under his watch but previously, but also taking action inside the company from what occurred in the aftermath. And that's a good thing. So I think it's important we come back to the interpretations of all of this. What does this mean for the rest of us? Is the federal government going to come after organizations who have suffered a breach, even those that have happened from negligence? Generally, no, if you disclose the incident. Hear me on this video. The CISOs that are watching this, the security experts that are watching this, it is important to disclose a breach. It's not up to you to decide, do we cover it up? How do we cover it up? It's not up to you to decide the significance of the breach. It's important that you disclose it. There are a lot of things that happen in the incident response process, but you need to make sure your playbooks do include disclosure and how that disclosure should be done. And you should think through, how do we have whistleblowing capabilities in case the organization does not want to have this happen? Because let me be honest, here's the fear of every CISO. Maybe I've walked into an organization that is having a breach right now and I don't know it, and then I get pressure to not disclose. And just like Sullivan, am I going to face federal or state charges from it? Nobody wants to go to jail here. And so how do I handle all of that? As a CISO, you need to be prepared for these consequences. It's not a fun part of the job, but it is unfortunately sometimes required. And it may be something that becomes what I call a resume generating event. But it's very clear here. The federal authorities have said enough is enough. They've drawn a line in the sand here when it comes to Uber, and they have said failure to disclose is obstruction of justice. This is their interpretation. Now we're going to see what carries out from this. We will see if charges actually carry through. We'll see the results of the court case. I will be following this, but the lesson here is clear for all CISOs. a breach should be disclosed. It's important that you do that. And by the way, there are also ramifications for CISOs who have already historically gone through an event that happened before, especially ransomware. Current versions of ransomware are very common at getting access to data and exfiltrating it in the event that an organization doesn't pay the ransom. And so what happens when you have a security disclosure event from a ransomware and a bad guy having full access to your network, and you pay the Bitcoin to keep them quiet, and you didn't disclose it? This is something to think about. I am no lawyer. I will give you no advice how to handle it, but I have seen some incident responders saying, hey, there are some CISOs out there that may be shaking in their boots from all of this. Again, going back to disclosure is the right thing to do. I'm not here to put fear in anybody's heart. I'm just here to say the news is very clear of what's happened. It is important to disclose your security breaches. So I hope this video has been helpful for you. Maybe a little bit contentious, but I want to know your thoughts. Do you agree with what's going on? Do you disagree? What do you think is going to happen out of all of this? And what lessons can we learn? So go ahead and leave a comment down below. Give me a thumbs up. Please hit the subscribe button if you like this, because I've got more content coming out all the time and would love to connect more with you. Thanks.